Okay.
Mayor Jacobs.
Here.
Newman Hickey.
Here.
Mr. Travellini.
Here.
Ms. Urbana. Here. Mr. Rodelius.
Present.
Mr. DeGiovanni.
Here.
Mr. First.
Here.
Ms. Christie. Here. Chairwoman Betcha.
Here.
Adequate notice of this meeting of the Bedminster Township Land Use Board was filed with the Township Clerk, sent to the Vernon News and the Spurrier News and to all subscribers, and posted at the Township Municipal Building, 1 Miller Lane, Bedminster, New Jersey, on January 6, 2023.
Please stand. The flag salute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'll open it up to the public. If anyone has anything that they would like to discuss that's not on the agenda, now's the time to bring it up. How about online?
I will ask that question. Anyone online, you can either raise your hand, unmute yourself. You can hit, what is it again, *9 if you're using a telephone, so that we can see if you would like to make a comment.
No one? I'll close it to the public. Okay, we have our minutes from June 29th that we need to approve. If we have a chance to read it, make a motion.
I gave comments, actually, Frank gave comments, that are not incorporated in this version. But Janine has the comments in regards to the reference to keeping the areas competitive with other opportunities in the region. The addition that Frank put in, Mr. Banish noted that the master plan and the examination reports had called attention to the changing fortunes of the regional office market, and specifically to the negative gradable impact of reduced assessment values. So that was Frank's addition, and Janine was
She's added that to our minutes. So the motion should include the change. So
moved.
second. All in favor?
Aye.
Same. Yeah. And you can get.
Okay, we have a letter from the Township Administrator, Robin Ray, dated July 3rd, regarding the office research village ordinance, which we will be discussing later. We have a determination of completeness. Paul.
Madam Chair, this is the Peterman application. This is for a accessory dwelling unit. There are some variances associated with that. We've gone back and forth with the attorney representing the applicant. There are still a couple of minor waivers required for completeness. It's my recommendation that they be granted. The application be determined to be complete and then we schedule for hearing.
Okay. Motion to approve.
Second.
Roll call.
This is a D variance, so
It's a D
the
variance.
mayor and
Yeah,
Colin cannot.
so
Mr. Travellini.
Aye.
Ms. Urbana. Mr. Rodelius.
Aye.
Mr. DeGiovanni.
Aye.
Mr. First.
Aye.
Ms. Christie. Aye. Chairwoman Betcha.
Aye.
We'll talk about that schedule later.
Okay. Okay, we're going to talk about our master plan. Frank?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have spent a substantial amount of time in the last couple of months, particularly last month, talking about some changes to the master plan related to the ORV district. And specifically, we amended the master plan. The governing body forwarded an ordinance amendment that implements the changes recommended in the master plan. And we're here tonight being asked to look at those changes and confirm whether or not it's consistent, or rather inconsistent, with the master plan. Demonstrate that it's not inconsistent with the master plan. The long and the short of it, and I'll go through the long in a minute, but just for clarity's sake, the long and the short of it is the ORV district was crafted initially in a location somewhat transitional around the village neighborhoods so that it could ameliorate the impacts of larger scale and more highway-oriented regional commercial development. So it was definitely, it had in mind a different character, and the changes that are being made here are adding some retail and restaurant uses in an effort to fortify the opportunity to remain competitive in the regional office market with the space we already have, and to attract new tenants to open spaces and new buildings to our zones that permit these uses. So what we're doing tonight is advising the governing body that having developed the master plan amendment and having reviewed the change to the ordinance, you can find that it's not inconsistent with the master plan, in part because we just amended the master plan last week, almost last month, and received the ordinance that clearly implements what it was we asked about. So that's the 40,000-foot version of why we're here. Now I'll try to quickly walk you through the particulars that I think should be part of tonight's record. The changes that were described, in part, were discussed a little bit earlier when we talked about the minutes, and the fact that one of the objectives in trying to fortify the fiscal health of the township by assuring that our rateable base can remain vibrant and strong and growing was that we looked at different standards in different zones that could either discourage or encourage development participants in those areas. And we concluded that the village...
Frank, this is Tom, I'm sorry. Sorry to interrupt you, Frank, but George, please recuse yourself from this because it is related to the
Yes, sir.
prior matter. Thank you.
Done.
I'm going to let Tom pick it up from there.
You've
I lost my place, I'm sorry.
said enough, Frank. It's consistent.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that while we were trying to make the zone an attractive location for tenants to stay or to come and locate, we also wanted to make sure that the attention that this zone was created to pay to the neighborhood, to the character of the neighbors and the impacts on the neighbors, was also well reflected in these ordinances. And so if you look at the third page of the summary that I provided to you, besides talking about some of the increases in floor area ratio and the way we've addressed other aspects of the ordinance, there are enhanced buffering standards, so there will be better buffers now than there would have been before. There are enhanced rear yard setbacks so that there's 150 feet now required adjacent to those very sensitive, smaller size lots that are down at the south end of Somerville Road. There are four, I think 4 in a row. So when you ever see the words adjacent lots, those adjacent lots are referenced in the ordinance by lot block number so that this enhanced buffering applies to those lots. And we heard from residents of those properties that they had a very distinct interest in having this find its way into the master plan and then be expressed clearly in the ordinance. I think we can find that happened. And building height limitations, we added a limitation that says no building within 150 feet of those same lots that I mentioned shall exceed 35 feet in height, meaning there'll be 2.5 stories at the most. So while these are changes that are intended to reinforce the character of the neighborhood at the same time as reinforcing the long-term viability of these office zoning locations, I think we can find that with the kind of attention Bedminster has always paid to neighborhood character, we have not sacrificed the significant element of open space. This is not any wholesale change in what's been done in the past, but rather a refinement of that. And would recommend to you that you can tell the governing body that you really don't like this ordinance and you'd like them to try it again. No, I'm sorry. Tell them that you find it not to be inconsistent with the master plan and you recommend its adoption. Thank you.
I have one question. Is there a typo on the bottom of the first page, H? Should it be B to E, B to C, third line from the bottom?
Bottom of page 1, did you say?
First page. B to C, all the way, third line from the bottom.
No.
No?
So all the uses B to G shall not exceed 0.21. So that's the total floor area ratio.
Right.
And then for the uses,
Oh, the permitted floor area
for
ratio.
for the
Got it.
D, E, F, G, for those retail uses that Frank mentioned, those are capped at a maximum of 0.025. So total is,
Well, what, yes, not sure I agree with you.
Steve, let's be clear. The intent of that provision would be that the retail, while there would be a permitted element of retail, would clearly be subordinate and a minor component of all the development on the site.
D through G is within the higher criteria.
correct.
If you look at the permitted uses, you'll see it's all
Yes,
listed.
B to G is everything other than public playgrounds.
And offices.
But why isn't the first one B and C?
No, because B and, it's not meant to be 0.021, well, 0.21 for B and C. It's meant to be 0.21 for everything, and of that 0.21, 0.025 can be for the retail uses.
Oh.
So they don't have to have any retail.
Right.
There'd be no retail, could be,
But if research and engineering, so B and C are included in that 0.21, what do they use the other 79%? Publicly there?
no, open space. It's open space.
Oh, it's open space.
Yeah, it's FAR.
All right.
Actually, let's put,
And
it's
within-
FAR, it's not
Yeah,
lot,
okay,
it's
got it.
FAR, it's not lot coverage.
We're not, it's
And
not a
within the-
percentage of the FAR, it's
Yes.
the FAR. Okay.
Within the 21%, 1/4% can be for these other uses.
Correct.
No. I think there's a grammatical error in G though. Because I think this can be read to say that restaurants are expressly prohibited.
No,
Only one.
there's only one comma.
Which are expressly prohibited. If you diagram the sentence, restaurants are expressly prohibited.
No. If you had two commas, that would be right.
Well, I suspect that if you wanted
We
to
just make it
recommend to
clear.
the governing body that there might be a little clerical clarification there that
I just
does
think we
affect
should
the
make it
ordinance.
clear. I understand what the intent is, but you could read it differently.
I
You
have a question.
could read it differently.
Are restaurants prohibited?
No,
No.
restaurants are.
I think this says it is, that they are not permitted.
I'm with you, Lou, that's why I said it.
Like I-
Restaurants, comma, except drive-in and drive-through restaurants are expressly prohibited. That's,
Why would you accept
The
drive-in
drive-ins and the
restaurants?
drive-throughs are expressly prohibited, not the
Including, you would say
restaurants.
including
Yeah, there's
drive-in
a
and.
which missing.
no,
You need a
No.
which?
it's an except. No, you don't.
Well, it would make it clearer. Why wouldn't you make it clearer? Because you're
Throw in a which
the
in your
redundant
recommendation
verbosities
back.
you're living.
No, it's actually less words.
You know, it'd be a lot easier if you just put the restaurants after the first clause, except for drive-in and drive-through restaurants, except for, right,
Listen.
Drive-in
you
and
guys are the
drive-through
grammarians.
Give you a
restaurants.
recommendation.
You guys are the
to
grammarians.
Attorney
I'm just
Velarde.
pointing it out as confusing.
Restaurants are expressly prohibited. Then nobody can,
Rich, are you trying to bring drive-through restaurants in?
I would love to, but.
Because that's what it's, that's
I
why
would
you're
love
a
to,
little
but,
suspect of your.
Clearly I voted
You're
for
gonna
that.
have to step
You're
down
still
for
trying to
that
get
one.
a drive-through or two or three or four.
Thinking about buying a couple franchises, but I thought again. Anyway, yes. We also pointed out that nobody does public telephones anymore.
But it's being deleted.
That's why it's
struck.
deleted.
Yeah, that's right. That's all. Anything in practice is strong.
Anybody else on the board?
No one.
Someone else.
Oh, anything that's otherwise.
Anything is on the
Anything
list.
else for Frank?
Should be.
Okay, let's open it up. to the
I have a
public.
question, Frank.
Oh, you do, okay.
Right.
Yes.
We went back and forth a little bit on this. G, could you weigh in on this for us? G, what it says and what it means? From a planner
The restaurant?
perspective.
It's Lou, it's actually a Tom Collins question.
Okay,
not a Frank.
maybe,
Yeah.
I don't want that to work today.
It's nice to be wanted. So you have to remember that this is a list of permitted uses. And at the beginning of the list, it's saying that these are the permitted principal uses in the zone. And that does include restaurants. And all the exception is doing is just what Larry said, accepting from restaurants, delivery, drive-in, and drive-through restaurants. You don't have to say which, you don't have to, but you like to leave the commas exactly as they are. This is the way John Bellardo wrote it for the Township Committee, and I'm satisfied that that means restaurants are permitted use in the drive-in.
So Tom, since this is the list then of the permitted uses, restaurants are permitted use. And we're
Yes.
just throwing out the drive-in,
It's a good way to do it. It makes it, it makes it,
Rich Travellini.
I got it.
Okay, I'm gonna open it up to the public. Right? Comment online?
Anyone online, if you want to unmute yourself, raise your hand, star 9, if anything to say.
Please come up.
Can I just ask a question about these research and engineering activities, just for a point of clarity? So this would include anybody who was modeling a product even, right? If they're making transistors, semiconductor chips, or developing some kind of, even some kind of drug, right? So if they got clean rooms within those premises, that's all good? You're asking me? When we say research.
That's a Tom, that's a
Is that what
Tom
that
question.
means, Tom?
yes, as long as it's development, not manufacturing. In other words,
Once they go into production, they can't do it there anymore, but they
that's
can,
right, that's right.
they can build prototypes, they can create prototypes, et cetera, but they can't do production of any scale there.
That's right.
And it was already in there.
Yeah, that was already technically in the zone.
Yeah, I sometimes get jammed up with this, what research means and doesn't mean. That's fine.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
So if the board agrees, the recommendation would be that you make the finding that the proposed amendment ordinance 2013-015 is not inconsistent with the land use plan, and you recommend its adoption.
So we should open to the public though first.
We did.
You just did.
Oh, okay, then fine. So that's a motion to do what Frank just said.
Motion.
Second.
We have roll call.
Aye.
Committeeman Hickey,
Aye.
Mr. Travellini,
Aye.
Ms. Urbana,
Aye.
Mr. Tijani,
Aye.
Mr. First,
Aye.
Ms. Christie. Aye. Chairwoman Bethel.
Madam Chair, if I could just add one thing. I think the governing body and the planning board worked really well together here. We did this because there was an ambition to have something good happen in the near term, and towns that can move quickly like this can make those things happen. And I'm very impressed with the way everybody cooperated and figured out what needed doing here. So give you all a lot of credit for that. Thanks for letting me help.
Okay, Paul, you've got, proposal here. Good luck, Rich.
First, I will give full kudos to Steve, where's Waldo first, who found the typo in the memo. Since nobody else found it, you either didn't read it, or you didn't pay that close attention. But what you have at the bottom of page 1 in this memo is a proposed lot coverage ordinance. And where this comes from was, we had several discussions at the board as to how much coverage there should be on a lot. And one thing we did here was we eliminated lot coverage by zone. Because why should a 1 acre lot in the R3 zone have different lot coverage than the same size lot in the R10 zone? Lot size is the lot size. That was the logic. So what this is intended to be is an overarching lot coverage requirement that would eliminate all the individual zone lot coverages, and this table would apply to all lots. They would eliminate the section of the ordinance that talks about lot coverage in non-conforming lots, because it all goes away with this. Because it's strictly based on lot size. And the way this was developed was the board asked, you came up with some ideas. This size lot should have this percentage coverage. This size lot should have another. And what I did was I normalized it, so if the threshold, if you have a 1 acre lot, you don't have less coverage, or if you have a 1.01 acre lot, you don't have less coverage than a 1 acre lot. Because because if you change the slope of the line, you just drop down and it's functional. It is a sawtooth progression that just doesn't really work very well. So the way that's corrected is that once you go through each increment of lot size, you have base coverage. That base coverage is the maximum permitted in the range below. And then the delta, where you go, for example, from 1 acre to 2 acre, all that area, you get 15% lot coverage. So then that's how this, goes up. And if you look at the second graph on page 2, that really shows how that line works. And you can see all along, the lot coverage is always increasing as your lot gets bigger. And that was one of the goals of the board. So that was the basic fundamental analysis we used. One thing that we had to correct was, the initial discussion was, all right, less than a half acre, this is just an example. Less than a half acre, you would have 30% lot coverage. A half acre to 1 acre, you'd have 25% coverage. Well, I can't make it 25% coverage because you get 27.5% coverage when you take the weighted average. So that's what this did. It just distilled all that down to the numbers and ended up with the targets that you're looking at. And what I did further on the bottom of page 2, where it says 9.0 acre lot, that's actually a 2.0 acre lot. That's what Steve had to correct for me. And if you recall, it was the planning board's objective to have a 2 acre lot to have 15% lot coverage. And the first line is how it calculates by the chart. The second line is when you take 15% of 2 acres. So it works.
That was the mistake that Steve.
What he found was that it was written as 9.0 acres instead of 2.0 acres. No, it was not a math error. It was a typo. The math is completely correct because I didn't do it. Can you say that again for the mayor? Oh, I knew that was coming.
The base coverage square foot is essentially, right, so if you look at the 1 to 2 acres, that 10,890 square feet is 20% of the first acre.
Correct.
And then it's 50%
Well,
on the.
Well, it's not. It's actually 25% of the first acre. Because the idea was to have a 1 acre lot have 25% coverage.
The 30% coverage.
Yeah, it's, what that is the maximum coverage in the half acre to 1 acre range.
Well, I looked through this, didn't understand that 2 to 3 acre, why does that jump, goes from 15 down to 5 and then jumps up again at 3 to 5?
Because that was based on the target established by the planning board back when we discussed this, that a 3 acre lot should have this percentage coverage. And I unfortunately, in my head, I don't recall what those numbers were, but in order to get that weighted average to work, that range that incremental coverage had to be at 5%.
So what would be the actual cover?
Well, the way this works is if you have a 2.5 acre lot, okay, you would get 17,424 square feet of coverage plus 5% of half an acre.
How do you arrive, I'm still confused about how you arrived at the 17,424.
17,424 is the maximum if you take
It's not
the,
15% of 2 acres.
no, it's not. But that's not what the target was for 2 acres. It's the
Oh, so
maximum,
they're cumulative.
it's cumulative going on.
Okay, now I get it, yeah.
You're not adding up the base coverage, though, are you? As you go up?
No, the base coverage is the maximum in the prior range.
Right, but, so each time you go into the next range, you start with that base and then you
You
add
start with the
the
maximum in the
increment.
prior range.
Right. Do we need some footnotes to help explain what this?
They're really on the top of the second page. What I did today was I showed this to the zoning officer. She scratched her head 3 times, which means I have to come up with some better footnotes. But I think what we're going to do is probably, once this, if the board's okay with this and it gets up as an ordinance, we're going to show some examples. What we're also going to do is create a spreadsheet that, you know, you plug your lot size in, it comes up with the size.
That's the easiest way.
And I have to do that before my summer intern goes back to school, because she can do it a whole lot better than me.
Okay.
You know, I noticed the way that Paul made his calculations, that I would have a non-conforming lot.
I'm not quite sure if that's the case.
Maybe we should do it.
Your existing coverage is 23.6%. And under the proposal, you'll be permitted 28.42%.
But then you've got the existing.
That's under the existing ordinance.
Oh, that's not existing as an existing as the.
Correct.
Yeah.
How do we give a hard time about that existing?
When you speak Latin, I'm lost.
Yeah. Okay.
Paul, can we make a sweeping generalization that overall the lot coverages have increased across the board?
Generally speaking, yes. That was really the guidance that the board gave me when we started this process.
Well, this is not impacted by easements
No,
or street corridors, anything like that.
no, lot coverage is based on gross area. It doesn't adjust for the resource constraints.
So resource constraints are adjusted for FAR.
FAR and number of lots in the subdivision.
So resource constraints are lot coverage or FAR.
Yeah, they relate to floor area ratio and not lot coverage. And I can tune it up with some of those comments, and like I said, we'll come up with we'll come up with a spreadsheet that I think could be put on the website that allows people to be able to just understand it a little better.
Yeah. All right, we'll open it up to the public. Any questions about the changes in the FAR?
Lot coverage.
Lot coverage. You're right, lot coverage.
You know, it almost would be possible to be able to go on the website and input the zone you're in and the size of your lot and have it do all the math for
No,
you.
you don't have to input the zone here.
Oh, right.
Yeah, the concept is that
That's the idea. We're gonna have that spreadsheet on the website. You
This
just put in
is
your lot
cross.
size, and it gives you your permitted coverage.
Yeah, I
And
like
this is
that.
across
Talk about
all the
user friendly.
residential zones.
Across all the residential zones.
So even in the village neighborhood where you can have commercial uses.
There's separate coverages for non-residential uses in those zones.
So that
Would not be impacted. This is just
This
for
is
residential,
for
uses.
Residential zones.
Specifically single-family residential uses.
Anybody online?
Again, anyone online, if you would like to unmute yourself, raise your hand, it's *9. Let us know if you have something you'd like to say. Not looking like that, is it?
So I think we need an approval on this top.
No,
We're not there
We're not
yet.
there.
We're not there yet.
The
Oh, I
next
thought
step.
we were just gonna approve this part of it, no?
Well, if you like the way this looks, the next step is I will work with John Bellardo to come up with the ordinance that
Okay.
does this,
All
and
right,
also
got
come
it.
up with the corresponding
All right,
spreadsheet to be able to back it up.
okay. All right, thank you. All right, then we're moving right along.
Good work.
Yeah, thank you.
Really get into the weeds.
R 20-206 is continuing to be postponed. Okay.
Do you want to, I guess the Peterman Board of Adjustments, so we can talk about that schedule later.
Sorry.
Peterman Board of Adjustments, so we can talk about that schedule later, after the hearing.
Okay, all right. So right now, we're going to Ann Brooks hearing.
All right, so you're going to the zoning board?
I believe you two can be excused.
We will.
It's nice to be in stuff on.
Wouldn't have any other
I
way.
like your shirt, Larry.
Thank you, Rich.
Fashion plate.
You have to compliment him on his now.
No, you're cringing. Now you might come out of the Penn State game happy.
He can't lose. Maybe he can.
Did I?
Good night, all.
You're welcome to come with me in Michigan. I'll stay home.
You don't have to leave, we have seats.
Good evening. Frederick Zelli on behalf of the applicant, standing in this evening for Vincent Bisagno. Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the board professionals. What we have this evening is a somewhat unique application because we're looking for a use variance and we can't tell you exactly what the use is going to be. But that's the problem. What we have now is a situation where the applicant has, as you know, run an antique and gift store at the subject location for approximately 40 years now. But she's retired, she wants to move on. And unfortunately, as you may know, if you've been into antiquing, it's just not an existent retail situation anymore. So that's the specific use that's been approved for this property, which is located in a residential zone. It's been a commercial property literally over 100 years. It was originally Anthony's General Store. And it is, as I said, for the last 40 years, been an antique shop. So we need use variance relief in order for the property to be marketable, so that it continue on with its historic use as a commercial property. But we need your assistance in determining what the appropriate type of commercial use for this property would be. We've already, as part of our application, eliminated certain obviously inappropriate uses for this property, such as healthcare, such as restaurant use, things that would require possibly overburden, for instance, a septic in the well and things like that, things that would require more parking than is available on the property. We want a low-key, non-intense use on the property, as has been the case for decades, but still maintaining the spirit of the original general store and the retail use concept. So for the record, this is for 285 Lamington Road. It's block 12, lot 7, located in your R10 zone. Despite being in that zone, it's only a 1.3 acre lot. Again, for over 100 years, what's been present there is a single-family home, the former general store, which is primarily the building in question here. There's also a large barn and a smaller barn further back. We're not proposing any construction, any physical changes to anything at this point. This is strictly a use issue. Specific relief that we need. The property has been the subject of at least 3 resolutions dating back to 1983, 1984, and 2009. Back in 1984, the resolution included a condition that the home
or rather the owner of the business, live in the home, live on site. A couple things have happened with that over the last few decades. One, it's just not as common a situation as it used to be. Back when it was Anthony's General Store, the house next door was Anthony's house, and it worked great. It's not the way it works as much anymore, as you know. Secondly, the appellate division in 2019 decided that those types of restrictions are probably not legal in this state. So even though certainly at the time in 1984, when the board passed that condition, they had no reason to think there was anything wrong with it, but the courts have frowned upon it in the past few years. But really the bigger issue is it's just not practical anymore, and Ms. Brooks will testify that that condition severely hampers her ability to sell the property. And again, the restriction as to the type of use itself is restricted. So we're seeking a release, vacation of that condition from 1984, and we're seeking additional uses to be able to be housed in the store itself. The home will remain a home, and the barns will remain accessory to the other two buildings.
I'm sorry, the barn would remain, what?
The barn will remain accessory use to the store,
Or to the store.
and or to, if it would end up that the property owner lives there or has uses for it related to the home, there would be nothing prohibiting that. But typically it would be used as accessory to the store for storage or what have you.
But it wouldn't be additional retail space.
No, we're not seeking additional retail space. So residential use in the home, retail space in the former general store, and the barns would be storage and accessory. The only thing that might, and I don't know if this is what you were thinking of, Mr. Farrar, for once, one thing that we might suggest that might be a good fit, and there's actually been somebody who's interested, not firm enough to come to you, but for instance, a tack shop. A tack shop for equestrian. So, they might have things that would be larger physically that they would want to have in the store, so maybe a customer might be able to see or something like that. It's certainly not a separate storefront or a separate.
It would effectively, those items would be stored in it.
What is the current use of the barn?
We'll get into that, but if you want to just answer that quickly.
I use it presently as a garage for my car and some storage, and that's it. I put cement on the floor, the first is cemented so that it is good for the garage.
We'll cover
I'm
it.
sorry, everybody,
She's
please
not
wait.
under up yet, so we understand.
please wait, Fred. Mrs. Brooks just testified, so she has to be sworn. Please, Ms. Brooks, please raise your right hand. Do you swear firm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please state your name and spell your last name and give us your address.
Jane Brooks, last name is Brookes, 285 Mountain Road.
Thank you. Before we go into testimony, what I would like to do is mark just one exhibit, which is an aerial shot. As both Ms. Brooks and our planner who's here this evening, James Kyle, will be referring to that exhibit.
Okay, that'll be A1, and and if she could identify it, that'd be good.
Yes, this is an aerial view of my home and the surrounding property.
And it reflects that the data source is the New Jersey Office of Information Technology, Office of Geographic Information Systems, BING maps.
Thank you.
Can we just back up a minute?
Sure.
You currently own the property, and you own the store or the shop with that?
I do own the property. I live in the store I had operated for actually 35 years, began in the business for 40. And I retired just about 2 years ago. So the store is vacant.
And properties for sale, are you trying to sell the property as a whole or trying to break up the retail part of the house?
It is one lot.
Yeah.
I would sell it as a whole. I don't have it on the market as yet. I've been speaking with a couple of investors who are interested in it.
So you would sell it as a whole, one lot
Yes,
with the house and the business.
and the farm. I'm
And the
not
farm.
selling the business per se, that's closed.
Right, I understand, but the
No, but
property.
the property, yes, which includes the general store.
There's no subdivision component to the application.
No.
Okay, I'm just trying to make it clear, so we understand. Thank you for that.
So, yeah, let's start. When did you purchase the property?
I purchased the property in 1983, but if you don't mind, I'd like to thank the board for taking the time to hear my requests. I appreciate it. And to answer your question in full. I purchased it in 83, actually my ex-husband and myself did. We had both from the area and we had been driving by and we saw this wonderful location with a general store and barns and thought this would be a great place to put an antique shop and a wonderful place to have a home. And we already had restored 2 other buildings from about the 1890s and had opened 2 other stores, one in Chester and one in Bayhead. So we already had the knowledge and the practice of having stores already and having renovated. The barn was terribly dilapidated, it was blown down, and the store had been vacant and the home for over 20 years. No one had been using it, it had been closed in 1960. Someone then purchased it, but they still didn't operate it. And so the building needed work, the house needed a lot of work. And we just felt that this was something that we could do and return to something special.
And what do you know of the historic history of the property?
Both buildings, the home and the store, are listed on the National New Jersey Register of Historic Buildings. And the store itself was known as Anthony's Store. And it operated from the late 1890s up until I took over. And Nelson Anthony and his mother Bertha, and they lived in the home next door. And when I bought the building, there wasn't any plumbing, there was an outhouse, physically an outhouse in the back. And we did take that down, but there's still a foundation there which we kept for historical reasons. And we did put in the bathroom. We had to put in heat, there wasn't any heat. It had a pot-belly stove on the first floor. Second floor was used just for storage. And I understand on the first floor where they have the pot-belly stove, some of the local gentlemen would come in and gather around and they would do their gossiping and they would play checkers, hang out. And the post office was there. There were cubbies in there, when the person was there. So that was very interesting. The store itself, I know some of you have been in, some of you have been customers, and I thank you for that. And it has the original general store counters that run from the front of the store all the way to the back. Original floor, wooden ceiling, it's just a magnificent building. And prior to the Anthony's having a store, someone else did have a store there, but it burned down over time. We don't know that much history about it, so I can only tell you about the Anthony's. As the story goes, some people believe that Bertha is still there, that there's a ghost in there. We heard people walking upstairs sometimes and no one was up there. And at one point, one of my employees was on a ladder. And we always said, you have to have a spotter when you're on a ladder, don't go up by yourself. And she did. And she said the ladder started to sway, and then all of a sudden it was put back in place. She just felt like Bertha was watching. So that's always been a fun story to tell. So we're not sure But if she is, I'm sure she's very lonely right now since no one else is in there.
When did you actually open as an antique store after you fixed up the building?
We opened in 1986.
Prior to that time, you and your husband appeared in front of the board for the 83 and 84 approvals.
Yes, we did.
And if you would, can you just describe, it's just in your own words, the resolutions speak for themselves, but what were the restrictions that you were under as part of those approvals?
Well, we were under one restriction, which is a tough one for both sides, is that the store must be owner operated. The owner had to live in the home and operate the store. And that was fine for us. Because, you know, back then you just don't look forward to 35, 40 years and say, well, by then I might not want to do that. So we're stuck with that right now. And it's going to be very difficult to sell with that restriction. Because today, not many people want to live and have a giant store. And the other restriction is that it must be an antique and gift shop. Well, antiques are really no longer viable. It's a past collection item. And people my age who are retiring are no longer interested in collecting, they're interested in downsizing and selling. So they really have been trying over the last many years to sell to me, and I didn't want them because, you know, we were downsizing as well. And the younger people are not interested in antiques, they're not interested in anything old or used anymore. They like disposable items, and they want maybe China items, and they go to Pottery Barn and buy Pottery Barn. And when that falls apart, they buy another one. So they're not interested in the antiques. So we need to be able to open it up to other businesses, which are not strictly antiques or gifts. And Jim has a list of what we think are viable concepts that work really well there.
You testified that you have not actively listed the property or formally listed it, but you have, I understand, informally put feelers out to potential buyers, potential investors, landlords, and potential uses, and can give the board a little bit of a flavor of what that's been like.
Well, I have a local investor very interested right now, but he's not interested with the restrictions. And so that's tying me up with him. I've got another investor who's really in the same boat. They need to know that it's going to be easy for them to rent the house and to rent the store. At this point, the local investor I'm in conversation with, I told him I would like to rent the house for 2 years. I love living there. I love my home. But I don't need my home and an empty store anymore. I want to see somebody in there. And I can no longer afford to pay for the store. I'm paying maintenance. I'm paying heat in the winter. My insurance has gone up. Everything has gone up. And I'm retired. I don't have any income anymore. So if I can't maintain it, it's going to go into security. And because I just can't afford it. And this area needs to have a good looking building. The neighbors need to have it, the town needs to have it, and I can't afford it anymore.
You were operating the business, were there restrictions of any kind on hours of operation?
There were, but in 2009, those restrictions were lifted.
So now you would be subject to whatever general rules there might be at the time, but nothing specific to your property.
Yeah.
Let's talk just a moment about the property itself. So you described the buildings. As far as, this is septic and well, as part of town, correct?
Yes, yeah.
Are there
We have two septics, one for the home, one for the store, and 2 wells, one for each.
You testified that there is a bathroom currently in the store building?
Yes.
Is that just a half bath? Okay, and is that the only plumbing facility of any kind in the building?
Yes, exactly.
And just for the record, just to give the board a flavor of the entire property, how many bedrooms and bathrooms are in the house?
I have 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. Lovely street and porch in the back. I can enjoy the view. I can enjoy the cows that are back there. It's a lovely spot. If you may, if you have the aerial photo, I can tell you a little bit more about the
Yeah, let's go
property.
into that. So you have in front of you Exhibit A1, which I believe will be our only exhibit. And yes, by all means, if you want to take them through that.
If you look at the center, lot 7, block 12, that's my property, and the larger barn is on the right-hand side of it. And then you can see a longer driveway that goes back to the shed. And even in the shed, we have kept a car in there as well. And the store is in the center, and my house is to the left. Behind us is property owned by Brady Realty. In fact, Mr. Nick Brady, who was a former Secretary of Treasury many years ago, has been in, and at one point, when I was getting ready to close the store, he approached me and mentioned that he would like to buy the property, he'd like to buy the lot for his son, who's in New York. Because when the family grew up in this area, the kids used to go into the store and buy candy. Nelson Anthony was candy, was very friendly with the kids. And so he approached me about that, but his son didn't want to leave the city. So that didn't quite work out. Good neighbors all around, but he's behind us. And I have a wonderful neighbor to the right of my home, Carol, who's actually here tonight as well. And next to her is the church. Across the street.
Just for the record, which church?
Of Lamington Presbyterian Church. And across the street from that is church property, which they lease out to a farmer. Next to that is the old schoolhouse, tiny old schoolhouse. And behind it is the community garden.
And that's directly across the street from the store.
That's directly across from us, yes. So very quiet neighbors. The cemetery is next to that. So they've been quiet.
Also quiet?
Yes, very quiet. And then to the left of that is another family, Bernie and Joan O'Reilly. And I spoke with Bernie, and he seems to be very fine with what we're doing as well. So all good neighbors. And none of the neighbors actually, from what I can see, none of them can see my school. So no matter what's there or what I've done to it, it's not encroaching on their space at all.
On your lot, how many cars can the parking area accommodate?
We have 9 spaces.
And as over the years, when you've been running the retail use at that location, has there ever been an issue with parking? Not having enough?
The only time that we've never had enough, we do have a holiday open house, and we did have a barn sale. And when it's not enough, we are very fortunate that the church allows us to park across the street, right across the street, at the schoolhouse. And so that's always been able to accommodate our parking, and then we give them a donation.
Those were for special events as opposed to your typical retail use. Is that fair to say?
There's always space.
We'll talk briefly about the reports that Mr. Farrar and Banish have issued. Mr. Farrar made a comment about the need for cars to back out onto Lamington Road, which obviously would be a concern. Is that in fact the case?
You don't back out into the road. There's plenty of room. It's a large enough parking lot that once you pull in, you can just back and turn around. It's very easy to get out, which has never been a problem. There's also, right in front of the store, there's a driveway. So there are 2 different entrances, 2 different ways to get in. And in the driveway in front of the store, you can also park there. And if you move over, park you should, and there's enough room for somebody to jump on and get out. So that gives us extra spaces, and then there's always extra spaces to go back towards the shed as well, because that is a gravel driveway.
And just cover this a little bit, including before you were sworn in, so let's make sure it's clear for the record. You're not proposing anything other than single-family residential use for the house.
That's right.
Address. And again, just for the record, so you're seeking relief from the owner-occupied requirement from 1984, and permission to have other than antiquing and gift shop uses, but low-intensity type uses that would be appropriate for the property. Is that fair to say?
I don't.
Nothing further from Ms. Brooks at this time.
Tom, I have a question for you, please. Tom?
Yes, Carol?
No, I forgot what the question was.
Was it how to unmute?
The
He's
uses,
here all week.
yeah, the uses, if we don't know what the use is now, would they have to come back to us to get the use approved?
If you're talking to me, the answer that they're seeking is no. I'm concerned that we're not getting any, I really appreciate it was a joke to say, we're telling you we don't know what the use will be. But frankly, when you ask for use variance, you have to say what the use will be. So I'm going to tell Mr. Kyle to please tell us the uses that he opines meet the standards for a D variance, because it's their burden of proof, not the board's.
That's right, and we do intend to present Mr. Kyle for that exact purpose, and he does have a list.
Could you repeat that, please?
We are presenting a professional planner, James Kyle, this evening, who will not only be giving you the general planning testimony, but also giving you a detailed list of some proposed uses that we feel fit the bill. And if the board has concerns with any of those, obviously we'll address those concerns. And if the board has any suggested additions to the list, we'd be happy to hear those.
I didn't realize you were saying that.
We did.
Very good. I guess I'll open it up to the public.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Just to be clear, you indicated that you'd spoken to some investors who may be interested if some of the restrictions that are now placed on the property were vacated. Did any of them give you an indication of what they think the store could be used for?
Well, we talked about it, and I gave him suggestions that I was thinking of. He also had some as well.
Are your suggestions to his, are they all on the list?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I have discussed it. He has a full list.
All right, but it's not a good part of his list in any event?
Pardon?
It would be part of his list in any event?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Question for Frank here. So Frank, these uses, since it's R10 zone, these uses are more like covenants that are traveling with the property at this point.
Here's the problem. Tom's the attorney, so I'm not going to play attorney. But the problem that Tom alluded to was we can't negotiate zoning for the property as part of this. They have to come to us and ask for explicit, specific uses, which I've heard they're going to do. And then you have to decide whether or not to say yes.
But my question maybe for Tom then is, these are not
Well, what I didn't finish
zoning
saying was
restrictions,
the
what
risk.
he has right now.
What I didn't finish saying was the risk that you run is if you offer up a bundle of rights that go with this, that's pretty much rezoning the property, as opposed to the rezoning that occurs when you say, yes, it can be a Wawa. Obviously not here, but I mean, when you pick a specific use and you say that use goes with the property, saying all these other uses can go with the property, well, I'll let Tom weigh in on that. I wanted to say all that before Jim got up because I think he's thinking about these things and maybe we'll be able to be responsive on some of that. But Tom, if you want to add to that.
No,
I have a question. I'm sorry.
so I don't want to add to it. I do want to respond though to Rich, and we should listen to Mr. Kyle before we go too far with any deliberations. But Rich, it's not really in the nature of deed restrictions. This is all about zoning, and the only zoning allowed is single-family residential use and farming. They have a prior use variance for antique store and gift with conditions, and they're asking to remove those at least two of those resolution conditions on their prior use variances. So it's an amendment to a use variance and to the conditions of a use variance. And Mr. Kyle will explain what they're seeking. Don't think of it as deeds or deed restrictions. Think of it as zoning, some use variances, and an amendment to the use variance and an amendment to the conditions that they are seeking. But we'll hear more from Mr. Kyle.
So the use variances that they received back in the 80s, that was 86 or so, 84, they would travel with the property upon sale.
Yes, it does travel with the property. And so will any use variance that if you were to amend it or grant a new one, that would also run with the land. And so would its conditions.
Okay, a couple of other questions before we hear from the plan. So it's R10. It's a pre-existing non-conforming use because it's only a little over 1 acre today, correct? So
that's for them to prove. That's for them to prove to you. Maybe the prior resolutions say that, but that's for Mr. Kyle to prove to you.
okay.
He's going to do a pretty thorough job. Maybe, like Tom said, the best thing would be let him give us his insights and then ask questions after that. Or not.
I'm trying to think what my other question is. Is it?
Or
so, my question is, I guess, and I'm maybe answering it for myself. She can't subdivide it because it's in R10 easily. She can't tear down the store because it's in a national trust.
Well, she wouldn't want
all
that.
these
It's
things
valuable.
are creating restrictions for it. I want to understand what her limitations are. We can sell it as a single-family house and sell the store separately if we subdivided it. But I don't know that subdivision was considered.
We're not seeking that.
I know you're not seeking it.
It makes sense to us to keep them together because historically they belong together.
So let him tell us what they're seeking, and then he'll figure out what that makes sense.
The one thing I just want to say before Mr. Kyle takes over, we have a very practical problem. You, of course, would love for us to come in here with a specific, with a proposed tenant and say, this is the use we'd like to have for this property, and we would absolutely love to be able to do that. And we've been working towards that for 3 years or so, Ed, at this point. And it's a catch-22 because anybody interested in the property is not interested in investing anything just to find out whether this board is going to accept their proposed use. So that's why we're trying to set up parameters, get a list of uses that the board agrees is appropriate and fashion it that way so that we know how we can market it in a way that results in the property being used in a way that the township would like.
There are so many options as to what it could be, and we'll give you our list and you may come up with more.
Okay, we're ready.
Hard to pick.
Let's open it up to the public. Anybody have any questions right now?
Online, does anyone, if you want to raise your hand, unmute yourself, David Smith. David Smith, go right ahead.
No,
Oh,
that's the
the
cursor. DW unmuted himself.
Okay.
I'll swear in DW then. Sir, do you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God?
Unmute. It's not there. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Screen.
Sorry, yeah.
Oh, screen. I'm sorry.
I'm advised by the applicant that it's actually a personal friend who's just listening in, so that's, I don't think they're actually.
Yeah, he does not have anything else. It is still muted.
Okay. Anyone else have a question for the witness?
May I, from the public?
Yes, Mr.
Whitman?
Whitpen?
Yep.
Mr. Whitpen, please raise your right hand. If you can put on your video, that would be good, but can you do that?
I will try to.
Thank you, Bob.
You're welcome.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. I'll
And please state
spell
your
my
name.
last name. Yep, it's Robert Whitpen. It's W-I, 2 T's like Tom, P like Peter, E like Echo, 2 N's like Nancy.
And Bob, if you don't mind, what is your address?
Well, I'm here in the capacity as president of the trustees of Lamington Presbyterian Church,
Okay, why don't you use their business or church address, please?
355 Lamington Road.
Thank you, Bob. Please
Yes.
go ahead with questions now.
I guess procedural and then general. Will there be an opportunity for the public to ask questions after Mr. Kyle's list?
Yes, there will be. And then after all the witnesses, there'll be an opportunity to actually testify and explain.
Thank you. And then I'm just generally, are we removing conditions? Are we adding conditions, or are we potentially both?
I'm gonna let Ann Brooks try to answer that question, but she may need help from her attorney, Mr.
I think the answer easily, we're seeking relief from 2 prior conditions. One is that the owner of the business occupying the store also live on the premises.
Understood.
And the other, that the use be limited precisely to an antiques and gift store. We're seeking broadening of that condition, not to eliminate antiques and gift stores, should somebody wish to open one, but to expand the list of possible uses on the site.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have, Madam Chairman, woman.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Anyone else? Do you want to raise your right hand, unmute yourself?
Seeing none, no one will close it. Okay. Have a witness?
That I'll ask Ms. Brooks and Mr. Kyle to switch places.
Thank you.
Yes, that Mr. Kyle be sworn in, please.
Yes, Mr. Kyle, please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your name and address, spell your last name.
Sure.
Thank you.
Name's Kyle, K-Y-L-E, and it's 2 East Broad Street in Hopewell, New Jersey, 08525.
Would you please give the board the benefit of your professional educational background?
Sure. I have a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Planning and Design from Rutgers, which I received in 1996. I've been a practicing planner for about 25 years. First licensed in 2001. License is currently in good standing. That's a professional planner's license from the state. I'm also runs with the American Certified Planners. Our office represents over 20 municipalities as their consulting planner, much like Mr. Banish does for you. I've also appeared before over 230 boards in the state. I've not ever testified here, I don't think, but many other municipalities in Somerset County, Warren County, a lot of surrounding.
Yes, the board will recognize and accept Jim Kyle's qualifications as a professional planner. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Have you performed a planning analysis of this property and this particular application? Please share it with the board.
Sure. So I was retained by the applicant to review the issues associated with this application. I reviewed all the material that was submitted, all the prior resolutions. I've been to the site twice, prepared the exhibit that is in front of you as A1. I've also reviewed the Township Master Plan. There have been a number of re-examination reports over time. I reviewed those as well, and the zoning ordinance. And I also met with Ann up at the property one day. We
kind of talk through her goals and prior use and things like that. So as we talked about, this is block 12, lot 7. It's at 285 Lamington Road. It's a 1.3 acre property. It has about 254 feet of frontage on Lamington Road, and it stretches about 187 feet to the north in the back. I'll dispose with a description of what's on the property. I think we've covered that pretty well already. But I do want to point out, as you can see on the aerial, the property itself has a number of mature trees, particularly in the front. There's a very large spruce tree that's located to the east of the store. There's also a hedgerow that you can see on both the west and northern side of the property. So we have a relatively narrow hedgerow that stretches on both sides of that property. To the east, on the other side of the barn, you can see that there is a portion of lot 1.08 that comes up to Lamington Road and is in between us and the nearest residential property to us. So that is an area that is not farmed. It's kind of been in succession, looks like maybe the last, maybe 8-10 years. There's a lot of vegetation that's growing up in there now. There's bigger trees at the street frontage, and then you can kind of see some cedar and some other things that are growing up inside there. So that's an undeveloped portion of lot 1.08 that's between us and our nearest neighbor to the east.
Does that provide a visual buffer between us and that neighbor?
It does. It's largely deciduous, but as I said, there's some cedars that are starting to pop up in there, and then the barn is also located in that area, so that also provides some cover to the east. As we talked about, the site served by well and septic. There are 2 wells, 1 for each building, and 2 septic, 1 for each building. And also talked already about the surrounding uses, so I won't do that either. The property is in the Lamington Historic District, so the great thing about when a historic district is studied and designated is the National Park Service does a very detailed study of all the structures that are located within the proposed district. So there's a lot of history, most of which Ann already went through. But the interesting thing about this is, so there was a prior store there before it was Anthony's store. I think it was about 1950 when that store was built. It burned down and was replaced with the structure that's there now. The house also dates back to the late 1800s. So both of those structures have been on this property for a considerable amount of time. Even if you take out the prior store, we're talking a very long period of time with both of these structures. The interesting thing about that study, and when they talk about the historical significance of the Lamington Historic District, is the fact that it survived. So this study was done in the 80s when this was designated. The fact that it survived intact all through, all the development that we've seen in Northern New Jersey throughout the decades, much like it was back in the mid-1800s, late 1800s. So they noted that so the significance of the district. It was a traditionally isolated community surrounded by open land, something that's rare as suburban development has progressed in New Jersey. And it also notes the rural character of the district. So they called it, and I'll quote it, an identifiable residential, trade, and meeting place surrounded by open land. So when you look at the study and how they put the boundaries of the district in, it includes a pretty good portion of the Brady Farm behind us, which is, obviously has no structures on it, but they felt the relationship of that open land surrounding that traditional settlement was important, so they included it within the district. So the point is that some type of commercial uses existed in the store structure since at least the late 1890s. And that, there may have been periods when it stopped, the building was vacant for 20 years, as Ann said, but traditionally this was a place where business was conducted over time. So I think we've also provided a pretty good summary already of the relief that we're seeking, so I'll dispense with that and I'll just jump right into the zoning. So this is in the R10 Rural Residential District. The uses that are permitted are farms and agriculture, detached dwelling units, public playgrounds, conservation areas, parks, and public purpose uses, houses of worship, public and private day schools or elementary and/or high schools, open-air clubs, and private boarding schools. Conditionally permitted uses include golf courses and clubs and airports. Permitted accessory uses, private swimming pools, tool sheds, sports courts, and other recreational facilities, off-street parking and private garages, fences and walls, signs, residential agriculture, home occupations, modified home occupations, and solar. So as had been noted, this is a non-conforming lot for the R10 district, which predated the township first zoning ordinance. We have a number of existing non-conforming conditions that are not affected by this application. Again, there's no construction proposed here or subdivision, but 10 acres is required on the lot size. We have 1.3. The minimum front yard, 50 feet is required. And we have 28.2 and 24.8 existing. Those are to the store and the single-family dwelling. And I should note that the ordinance under the grandfather provisions provides for kind of a sliding scale based on lot size and changes the front yard and various bulk standards based on the lot size. Minimum front yard accessory building 50 is required. We have 39.4 to the barn. And then the side accessory 15 is required. We have 3.9. There's also a non-conforming condition for lot coverage. 15% is permitted and 21.9 is existing. So again, we're not proposing to change any of those that are legal existing non-conforming conditions, but I just want to. So on the D1 use variance, as the board has heard many times, I'm sure, we're required to demonstrate both the positive and the negative criteria. So on the positive criteria, we have to show that the site is particularly suited to the proposed use and thus promotes the general welfare, or that the purposes of this land use law promote. The negative criteria, there are two components. First, that there's no substantial detriment to the public good. This refers to the impact of adjacent properties. And second, that the grant of the variance won't substantially impair the intent and purpose of the zone plan. Now, under the case Medici v. BPR, we have to demonstrate the second prong, an enhanced quality of proof. And that is that the grant of the variance is not inconsistent with the intent and purpose of the zone plan ordinance. We essentially have to reconcile why the governing body has continued to not permit the uses that we're seeking. So for the particular suitability of the site, again, we have a property here where we have a structure that has traditionally been used for commerce and commercial uses for a very long time. Yes, it did cease at certain points, but the use was never abandoned, and continued that when she bought it in 1983 and came and got relief from the board for her specific use. The interior of the building, if you've been in there, it's open. So when you walk in, you see the counters on both sides, left and right, but the entire first floor is completely open. So there might be a column, one or two in the middle. The same is true on the second floor. It's a pretty open space. There were offices that were put up there some time ago. There was area for storage, and that is open as well. So when you think about the use of this particular building for any kind of retail or office uses we're proposing, the structure itself is suitable for that based on its configuration. If someone were to try to use this as a dwelling unit, it would have to be completely renovated on the inside, walls constructed, things like that. It only has the single half bath, as we discussed. No other plumbing facilities, sinks, kitchen, full bath, shower, anything like that in the building. So when you think about how that building is currently constructed and what's in it, it's really more suitable for some type of retail use like Ann was conducting, or maybe some other type of use like office. There are also existing site improvements here that we can continue to use for any non-residential use that is located in that building. So we have 9 parking stalls that are located to the south of the barn, and those stretch to the west, kind of towards the store. Those were delineated on the previously approved site plan from 1976, I believe, as 10 by 20 parking stalls. So currently, we generally do parking stalls at 9 by 18. I don't know what the township standard is. Maybe Paul can help me. Is it 10 by 20 or 9 by 18?
I don't recall what it is.
Okay.
Generally, we approve 9 by 8.
Okay, so 9 stalls over 90 feet, if they're 10 feet wide. If we made them a little narrower, 9 feet, we could get 10. As Ann said, there are also, you do have the ability to park in front of the store on that kind of semicircular drive that goes out to another egress to Lamington Road. if you ever looked at a Google Street View of the property, you probably saw a van that was parked in front of the store. So plenty of parking for the types of uses that we would anticipate here. The township ordinance requires one space per 225 square feet. Don't have architectural plans, so I can't tell you what the exact net habitable floor area is, but the footprint of the building is about 1,400 square feet, taking the porch out. So 2,800 would be the maximum. In past resolutions, there was reference to 2,750, but I can tell you that the entire second floor is not usable because of the stair that goes up the back. There's a bathroom up there. There were partition walls that were put in for offices, so it's probably not 2,800 net habitable. But we can utilize that existing parking area. There's adequate access to the site from Lamington Road. As Ann said, we had noted Paul's concern about, cars potentially backing out onto Lamington Road, which doesn't need to happen. I actually went there tonight and did the movement myself, and you can back into the drive aisle and then just pull out because the mouth of the driveway is so wide, it gives you a pretty good space where you can easily do that and pull straight out.
Is it fair to say that since there's no proposed change whatsoever in the interior space from what's been approved previously, we have an existing approved condition with regard to parking space?
We also have property in this case, and you can tell from Exhibit A1 that's relatively isolated from surrounding properties, and particularly residential uses. So obviously the old schoolhouse across the street where there's a yoga studio, maybe less of a concern, commercial business to another non-residential business. But as far as residential uses, we have the lot to our east, which that structure is about 170 feet to the east of the barn. And then as you go to the west, there are two dwellings, one on the corner of Black River Road and the other on Rattlesnake Ridge Road, the O'Reilly farm. Those are about 470 feet to the west. In between, you have a lot of vegetation. The O'Reillys have, on the east side of their lot, they have a lot of large spruce trees, so you can't really even see over in this direction from their property. And there's a lot of vegetation between the other dwelling on Black River Road. As you look east, you can't really see over this direction. So the fact that we don't have a lot of residential uses abutting the property kind of tends to limit any sensitive receptors from commercial business. So I think for those reasons, the site's particularly suited to the proposed uses, we'll say. I think there's also purposes of the MLUL that are promoted by the grant of the variance. Purpose A, to promote the general welfare. Purpose G, which is to provide sufficient space in appropriate locations for a variety of uses. And then also purpose J, which is to promote the conservation of historic sites and districts. So I think as far as the public welfare and purpose J, historic buildings and structures are really a labor of love for the people that own them. They're expensive to maintain, and without someone occupying this building and putting it to good use, that makes one. So it's important, to put uses, and again, we're proposing uses that we think are, relatively low impact. This is not going to be a general store, convenience store, restaurant, anything like that. We have a lot of coming and going. But it's important to the protection of these resources that they be able to be used and thus maintained. So the grant of the variance in this case will permit that. So the hope is that you have a tenant that goes in, you have an owner that's maintaining the building, and that's going to help preserve these historic resources in their current form. The structures are in very good condition. I'm sure you've been by there. Both the house and the store have been well maintained, and they're really key contributing structures to the district. So the grant of the variance will help ensure that in perpetuity. As far as the negative criteria and any impact, substantial impact, at the end of the day, this is really going to come down to the intensity of uses that we're going to give you a list of, really as compared to what Ann was doing there with the antique shop. So if you go back to the resolution, the original approval for use variance, there was talk of about 20 customers on weekdays, maybe 40 on weekends. The rentable space that we have here, as I said, is relatively small. So this is not going to be a big office. We definitely think medical office, doctor, dentist is not an appropriate use for this site because there's a lot of coming and going with that, patients, things like that. So the low impact commercial uses and office use that we're proposing are really going to be about the same impact as the antiques. Think about it. If it was an office use, say it was an architect's office, that's primarily employee traffic coming and going. You might have a client come in every once in a while. We rarely have people come to our office. So those types of professional office uses, the impact we think is going to be about the same as the antique store, where you had probably a fairly significant number of retail customers that would come to the site. The septic system also presents limitations for the types of uses. So obviously restaurant, things like that are water intensive, generate a lot of septic effluent are not going to be appropriate here. Both of your professionals have made a comment, that we need to ensure that the septic system can support the uses that we are proposing. We're not aware of any issues with the septic system at this time, so we don't really think it'll be an issue, but we can talk about that a little bit more. As I said, we also have good separation to the uses around us, so 170 feet to the barn, to the residential property to the east, 470 to the west, to the two homes that are located over there. So I think there's enough space between the properties. The uses that we're going to describe are really lower intensity, not a lot of coming and going, much less retail traffic or foot traffic than you would have with the antique use. So I think for those reasons, there won't be a substantial impact on the adjacent property. And finally, on the intent purpose of the zone plan, while there's not a purpose statement for the R10 district in the ordinance, it is discussed fairly extensively in the master plan. And really, the goal of the R10 was to preserve the countryside atmosphere. That's kind of a quote from the master plan: countryside, rural atmosphere. There are also the goals of preserving agriculture and preserving sensitive environmental resources, as well as groundwater protection and surface water protection. So there were a lot of environmental goals that were wrapped up in the R10 district. The master plan also contains goals and objectives of its own. I'll just read a few of them. To maintain, so this was goal B, to maintain, conserve, and enhance the special character of the countryside and historic villages which have made Bedminster Township an attractive place for many generations, and manage future development to preserve the rural character, including the township's meandering streams and brooks, open fields and pastures, trees, shaded streets, and rural lanes. To protect, maintain, and enhance Bedminster's unique sense of place, which includes diverse residential neighborhoods, attractive non-residential uses, historic settlement areas, and scenic landscapes. Another is to plan for a reasonable balance among various land uses that respects and reflects the goals of the master plan. And to establish development densities and intensities at levels which do not exceed the planning capacity of the natural environment and current infrastructure based on the sensitivities and limitations of these systems. So I think, given that some form of commercial use has occurred at this site and in this building over a long period of time, that continued use, even in a different form and a different type, in my opinion, is not inconsistent when you look at the discussion of the master plan about the purposes of the R10 zone, and then also the goals and objectives of the master plan as well. And I think broadening the uses that can occur here and the benefit that the community is going to get in the maintenance of the structures, making sure they continue to be a viable part of the Lamington Historic District is kind of an important benefit that we can only get through this process. I think addressing the second part of the Medici enhanced proof of reconciling this, I think based on the relatively isolated nature of this, the proximity of neighbors, the long-standing commercial use that we had on the property for well over 100 years, really a lack of residential dwellings that are immediately adjacent to the site that could be potentially impacted. And again, the historic preservation benefit that we get out of making sure that these structures are used and maintained, I think is pretty much the way that we can reconcile the grant of the variance here in this case, the fact that this use is not. So large portions of the R10 district don't have a situation like this. It might be open land, and when you look at the goals and objectives, in this case, the analysis is a little different here because we've had this commercial use on this property for so long and it's been part of it. So I think for those reasons, we can meet the negative criteria and the positive criteria that the board could grant relief. Now, what I want to do is just run through some of the things that we had come up with, and a lot of these come right out of the township's zoning code. So these are a lot of uses that are permitted in the village district, the village commercial district, some in other districts, but they're really, again, in the same vein as the antique shop. I think antique shop and gift shop is one that could continue if somebody did want to have that and do that. We talked about saddle shop and tack shop for equestrian uses. That would actually be a really good one, just given the rural nature of the municipality, but the number of equestrian uses that we have in this area in general is pretty significant. So, and again, there was interest in someone potentially doing that. Some of the other ones, bookstore, very much like the antique shop. Some of the other ones that were there, shoe store, clothing store, tailor, like if someone was a tailor and just wanted to have a shop where they could do clothing repairs, that's a relatively low intensity use. Furniture store is, again, much in the same vein as the antique shop that existed and was previously approved. A stationery store, fabric store was another use that's listed in the commercial zone that would probably be appropriate here. Professional office, and again, not medical, so no doctor or dentist, but if you think about an architect, an engineer, an accountant, a planner, a lawyer, real estate broker, insurance, similar professional uses that would be a small office use that typically doesn't have a significant number of employees that could operate at this site that would be relatively low intensity. Big art gallery, if a photographer wanted to use it as a studio, that would be a good low intensity use. An interior designer wanted to have an office there and like a gallery space. Yoga studio, which we do have across the street in some measure already, or a travel agent. So that type of use, a lot of the travel agency work occurs online now, but a lot of them want to have an office space that they can occupy. So the things that we would not want to put here, medical or dental office, personal service use like a beauty parlor, barber shop, nail salon, things like that. Any type of restaurant or food use, we are not proposing. And then the other uses that are typically permitted in commercial districts that we kind of eliminated: food market, bakery, drugstore, sporting goods shop, hardware store. Those were all things that we didn't really feel would be appropriate in this. So, and the testimony that I provided you on the negative criteria was really in the context of this list of uses that I just provided, or this idea of list of uses. With that, I think that's all my direct. Madam Chair, I'm happy to answer any questions the board may have.
Okay. You don't have to ask him a question about everything he said.
Okay.
By the way.
So, first of all, I'm assuming that tearing down the store is not being considered because it's in the trust. You couldn't do that easily.
And you have, Rich, it's not in a history. Just because it's on a historic list doesn't mean it's in a
So
historic.
it could potentially be.
Private money can do what private money wants to
Expand
do.
the residential uses there.
They could tear it down tomorrow.
Yeah.
They could get a demolition permit tomorrow.
You tear it down what?
But they're not talking about tearing it down.
I know you're not
I was
talking
gonna
about it.
ask
I'm
if
just
they were
looking
gonna
at-
leave the windows and doors the way they are.
I'm just talking
You go
about
right to
the
tearing it
options. She's
down.
been trying to sell this for 2 years. Meantime, the fire department's, they gotta keep the heat on so that it doesn't, all that other good stuff, right? Pipes don't burst, all that good stuff.
Yeah, there's no intent to do that, and I can assure you that any investor that's looking at this property is going to use the structure that's there. So that there's no intent to do that.
And there was no consideration of trying to subdivide it so that there was a store use residential.
I mean, this lot is already just more than a tenth of what's required for the district, so it would be a difficult application to get.
But the 10 acres came along after this building.
Oh, it did, no, for sure,
Yeah.
but,
All right, so that being said, the uses that you're talking about are all meeting the recommendations that have been made with respect to consumption of water and so forth and so on. But it seems to me that this building has been a general store forever, 150 years almost, if you go back to the one that burned down before. And so all of those commercial uses that sold various different types of products, we've just, with the 1984 limitations, it was limited to antiques and gifts. But before that, it was, you could have sold anything there.
Correct.
So now we're going back to those pre-1984 wider uses.
Think of it this way, you're providing an economic incentive for the building to stay and be maintained well. You're providing the opportunity for continued commercial use, which is sort of the historic precedent of why the building is there in the first place. The reason I asked if the windows and doors would remain as they are and be repaired as opposed to replaced is because frequently, probably know better than anybody on the board, going to do a commercial retrofit for a commercial business, there's a metal door that goes with that. There's some glass metal units that go where the window spaces are. I don't think they're looking for that. I think what we're hoping is that Jim is telling us, Brooks is telling us that they like what they have. If they have more uses to occupy it, it could support itself and justify being well maintained into the future. It's kind of the kind of fit that we want, and the tricky part for me is just how do we grant a variance for a big pile of stuff? That's where Tom has to weigh in on what we can do.
But we don't know what the new owners want. What the new owners want to go through those, what the new owners want to do those.
If you said retail use except for a variety of things, and you didn't enumerate all the things you meant, you just said what you can't do, that would be a little clearer, a little cleaner. Because there were lots of retail, I think exactly as Rich said, they could sell anything they wanted at a general store. They probably modified what they sold at different times in history because of what people wanted.
I think the reason why we would agree to some of this is in order to keep the building looking the way the building is looking. I mean, I think that's the whole purpose
It's
of
a
it.
signature piece
It's a
of
signature
the
building. I mean, so it would be, are we able to allow some or not, whatever, and write it in the agreement that the building needs to look the way the building looks now, that whoever comes in and wants to put in a furniture store can't change the look of the building.
Well, I think that was part of Mr. Kyle's argument, right? Was that one of the benefits of this was keep the building as it was.
I agree.
That's what I heard.
But if it's gonna be sold.
I understand that, but that's the record on which this variance would be
If the
granted.
condition for the commercial uses that you're gonna grant tonight is that the facade be maintained, now you've got a step beyond what the historic standards require, which is good. Because now, in order to use it commercially, you have to maintain it the way we want it to look. Yes, Steve?
I really have two, I guess, related questions. One is, do we really have the jurisdiction to issue this kind of a variance? I mean, it seems to me, Tom, that what we're really talking about, and I'm in favor of this, of everything we've heard, but it just seems to me, and I don't know whether we have the jurisdiction to do this, is we give a resolution that this is something we favor, if we have the jurisdiction to do that, but I don't know how we have the jurisdiction to give a variance for something that we don't know what it is.
So that was my question, basically.
Right, but if they came in and said it was retail before with limitations, we'd like it to be retail now without limitations, we could grant that back. The thing is, when we start to articulate this long list of things you can do, it sounds like you've rezoned the property for this long list of things that.
Well, you could say you rezone the property in either event because it was a non-conforming use, and certainly something 30 years ago doesn't have any weight now. But
The hard part at the core of this is, what are they selling, right? What are they marketing to a buyer? So they could sell it on a contingency basis, and the buyer comes, and the buyer buys it on the contingency that he can get an approval to do what he wants to do. And then he's coming in here 6 months from now or sometime after the sale to try to get his ideas approved. So all we're trying to do right now is to.
No, I don't think that's, what they're asking for is for them to be able to go to the zoning officer and say, based on what we have variances for, we want to put this use in that building. They don't
Right,
come
they're
back
trying to
here.
avoid that.
Yeah, they don't- yeah, I'm trying to say they're trying to avoid the
As
contingency.
opposed to what would ordinarily
Yeah, they're
happen,
trying to
which
avoid
is
the contingency.
one at a time, you come back and ask.
Yeah,
for
which
one thing
is-
and the next.
And my
So
second, go ahead.
If we define it the way you described, broadly, as all retail uses except for the ones we might take exception to, we don't have to get into this busybody list of things we like and we don't like.
That's my sense. I really want Tom to weigh in because it's more of a legal question than that. And the question would be, is what you're being asked to do tantamount to rezoning the property which you don't have the authority to do? That's the question. And I'm not a lawyer, so I can't tell you.
If we, Tom, if we approve this variance application, such as it is, would the new user have to come back with a site plan?
The way, no, let me answer a few questions. The answer to that question is no. They're saying, but that could be a condition that you might impose, but they don't want that condition. Okay, maybe they'll agree to it, I don't know. It is an issue that it might help resolve the uncertainties associated with the list of uses and their uncertainties. And it isn't that draconian to say that the tenant, or especially here, if it is a tenant, has to come to the board for approval of a site plan or waiver of site plan. But let's step back to the first question is, do you have jurisdiction? And we can also defer to Mr. Zelli and to Mr. Kyle, and I respect their opinions, of course, but generally speaking, a zoning board always has jurisdiction to hear and potentially grant use variances. And the only real question mark that ever really comes up is like this case called Dover Township versus Dover Board of Adjustment, in which a property owner is seeking a substantial deviation from the ordinance, usually for a large tract of land that's consuming a large portion of the zone. It's called the substantiality test. There's different parts of it. It doesn't really seem to kick in here because the contrary is true, that they are really seeking to change their prior use variance, but they're seeking to change it in a limited way, they say, which you may not agree with, for additional retail where only, and I have to say, I really think the only use allowed is antique store and gift store. I really don't care about the general store. I really don't care about the history. I think that sort of expired with the 1984 approval and 83 approval. But that being said, they have the right to come to you to ask for that use variance. And the only reason it would not be in your jurisdiction is if it was effectively making a substantial change to a substantial portion of the R10 zone district. And they're saying the opposite. They're saying one small lot in the zone, which is very large, by the way, is being proposed to have an amendment to its prior use variance. So I don't really think it meets the substantiality test of Dover Township versus Dover Board of Adjustment or similar cases. Mr. Kyle did tell you the standards. He's right. He listed them well. He also tried to prove to you the Medici negative criteria, enhanced burden of proof. That's a little hard, but I would say to you, it is very unlikely that the Township Committee would ever allow commercial in the R10 zone district on any property, including 1.3 acre parcels. So it's not really like Medici. It's not really a problem of Medici, but you're the gatekeeper. You, the Board of Adjustment, have a very significant responsibility to determine whether and to what extent you would be willing to grant any use variance relief in this particular property. And those prior conditions were important to the prior board, namely that it be limited to gift and antique shop, and two, that the owner occupy it. And I didn't hear Mr. Kyle testify about this subject, but I read what was written in the application. I'm somewhat familiar with the case law that's being cited by Mr. Zelli. I really don't think there is any prohibition against a condition that's in this use variance because it's a very specific condition for this use variance that the owner occupy it. That was what was said then. That is still the law as to this property. I don't really think the Point Pleasant case means what they're arguing it to mean. And I didn't really hear Mr. Kyle push very hard on that subject. They're pleading with you to please remove that restriction. And I think they have the right to plead with you to remove that restriction. But I think you have the authority to say yes or no to that, and also to say yes or no to the expansion of the uses allowed in the use variance. I personally found that having a list, if we're not going to require future tenants to come to you, if you're going to allow this and you're going to allow the removal of deed restriction, the conditions of the prior approval requiring the owner to occupy the store and the house, if you're going to allow that change, then, and you're not going to require site plan for future tenants of the store, then it probably would be wise to specifically list only those retail uses that you would ever even envision allowing, because I absolutely don't want you to allow grocery stores, restaurants, convenience stores, as we know would be a problem, and similar high intensity retail uses. And so Mr. Kyle was trying to give you a list of low intensity retail uses similar to what some of the ones you allow in the VN district are, and to prohibit restaurants, which I think they need to because of septic and other reasons. So you're the gatekeepers and you have a specific request for this change. It has to, if you were to approve it, it has to be a 5-0 vote. We have to open to the public and hear everyone's interest, who's interested. But that's sort of some words of advice, but I'll be glad to answer more questions, but it is your call. And I'm satisfied you have jurisdiction to grant or deny, or to grant with conditions, even conditions that the applicant hasn't offered.
We were just discussing internally, one possible approach would be to rely by reference upon one of your VN zones list of permitted uses and then subtract from that, for instance, restaurant uses or whatnot that might be allowed in those zones that we're not proposing for this site. Instead of trying to come up with an exhaustive list of low impact, find some way to help Mr. Collins also in trying to draft a resolution for this, to reference one of your own lists incorporated into.
I'm not really happy with that idea because that does sound like it's changing the zoning. And we're not changing the zoning, we're dealing with a use variance. But Mr. Kyle did, I write very quickly, so I wrote down almost everything Mr. Kyle said about the list of uses. I was waiting for that to be in writing. I didn't see it in writing. I think he could put it into writing. We could come back and talk more about the conditions. I don't really feel comfortable saying a particular reference to a zone district, because that's not what this is. This is nowhere near any VN zone. This is what it is.
But Frank, Tom, if you drafted a resolution that included the waiver of the ownership requirement and a list of excluded retail uses, do we have something there?
Not enough, because retail grows. Retail is huge. Retail is an incredibly ever expanding universe of things, as we see from the modern technologies and preferences. So having a list helps you. It helps you keep it focused on low intensity, low traffic, low parking, low septic, low everything. And then if they need something more than the list, they need to amend the use variance, just like they are doing now 40 years after the first use variance.
One comment I would make, Madam Chair, based on the list that was provided, I would not recommend that you have a yoga studio or any fitness studio.
Right.
It's going to be generating people coming in for classes, and I think you specifically want to exclude yoga/fitness classes.
Yeah, Pilates.
Yeah, anything with indoor recreation tends to require about, more like, strangely enough, one parking space for 100 square feet, because the turnaround is so great. So I agree with Paul on that. I'm not saying you should grant this approval. I'm saying if you grant an approval, you should limit the uses similar to the 1984 limitation. I also am concerned about this no occupancy idea. Or I don't even fully understand the concept. If Mrs. Brooks would explain, is she going to live there and rent the store? Is that the idea, or is the?
No, what she's proposing, as she testified, is that she wants to live there herself for approximately another 2 years. But then after that, what we're assuming is going to happen is that an investor will buy the property and rent out the store for commercial use and the house for residential use, obviously. We have no objection to it. We're proposing that the house be designated to remain as a single-family home, not as a commercial use.
I have no problem with that. I think it makes sense. Look, she's been here 40 years, a part of the community. It's a beautiful building. It's historic.
George, I get the feeling everybody's pretty sympathetic to what's being asked. The tricky part of this is, what are we saying? We're saying yes to.
Well, what did we do on the second floor of the car wash? Remember when they were?
We didn't do anything.
I'm bringing that up. That's a sore subject.
No, well, wasn't there some kind of situation where they had to come back to us?
They weren't supposed to use.
Those other buildings at the car wash, the two houses up near
The one in the
street.
front, the
Right.
second floor, they wanted to do something, and didn't we have something where they had to come back to us, or there was give and take on that? Help me somehow.
But what we're trying to establish.
They wanted to put more yoga. They had yoga studio was over intensified, and then they want to put more space. Make it office.
And somehow we said they could do something, but they had to come back to finalize it.
Essentially, there's two ways in theory that it could be set up. One is, as Mr. Banner said, retail except for, and then list the things that you don't want. The other would be to list an affirmative list of things that you do approve. And if it's handled that way, then if a tenant were to come in who is not clearly on that list, then they would have to come back to you. They're not prohibited from doing that, but at least we would have a substantial enough list to be able to have a chance at successfully marketing the property.
Let me, if I can just offer one thing. I agree with Tom that we don't want to say the list that's in a certain zone applies, but when we crafted the list in the BN2 district, it was because we wanted limited commercial uses. So these conditional permitted uses, they do include a couple that Jim said you wouldn't want, and Paul would say you didn't want, but here's the list. Antique shops, appliance repair shops, art galleries, barbers, beauty shops, no. Bookstores, clothing stores, daycare centers, no. Fabric stores, florists, gift shops, hardware stores, hobby shops, interior decorators, nursery schools would be a no. Offices, shoe repair shops, shoe stores, sporting goods stores, maybe not. Tailors, upholsterers. That's a pretty big list of stuff that we went through and vetted for the relative lower intensity, and partly because of where the zone is. Somerville Road.
And that's pretty much where Mr. Kyle got most of his list from. It seems like it's consistent with that.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you're looking for what low intensity is, we've said that in the past.
I think if they're looking for a little clarity, if you give a list of things that we're okay with it, right? Because the exclusions always bother me, because there's always something you don't want that you left out of the exclusions. Right? But somebody can take a look at the things we're okay with and say, well, I think I fit comfortably in the same genre, and it might give them a little comfort if they're not specifically, that it's sort of what we're going for, right, as opposed to shooting the dark.
Right, and as a practical matter, your zoning officer is going to be the first gate and will make the decision as to whether the proposed use literally fits on the list. And you're right, if it doesn't, then they have at least the ability in their own mind to say, well, am I likely to get the use variance because it's close enough?
But if you write the list so that it says limited to, and you enumerate 10 things, that's different than if you say such as, and you enumerate 10 things.
You know, I'm
What do you
saying
like? You
limited
like, do you prefer the such as? I think what the board's suggesting is you want to nail down what it is you're saying yes to, so you know that now.
I would agree with that. I mean, we
That's what you're asking for.
Yeah, we looked at this, and it's, what fits in the context of the site, the building, the surroundings. And we thought these were kind of the low intensity types of things that would be a good fit there, that won't have an impact on the adjacent property. So that was the goal.
I'd like to just make a comment.
And can I slow people down a little bit? Let's get open to the public to get
Okay, well,
full input from the public, including questions of they can do now questions of Mr. Kyle and testimony. And we are very interested in hearing from the public. I know you are.
I will open it up to the public. Anybody online?
Raise your hand, unmute yourself, your video, and show us.
We don't see anybody.
Okay. Thank you. Now, Luz, please go ahead. Sorry.
I'd just like to make a comment rather than a question, and I think that the day and age of owner-occupied businesses are few and far between at this point. I was an owner-occupied business. It became very difficult over time, so I would be in favor personally of, waiving that restriction.
Just procedurally, I will indicate that I have no further questions for Mr. Kyle. He's indicated his testimony is finished, just so you can enable the public to give their comments. We have no further witnesses.
I have a question. Oh, Frank, just look up. If we use the such as language, then if somebody wanted something that wasn't in the such as list, then there'd be an interpretation issue and they'd have to come back, right?
No.
Well, the zoning officer could make the determination that it's close enough under such as. I agree with Tom and Frank, you want to use the list, limited
Such
to.
as is just a list of examples, not.
Use what?
Use limited to,
Limited
and then the list, because like I said, is cell phone store kind of like a shoe store? Or a stationery store, or what is it? Is it an appliance?
That's really
That's why I would be very careful about that, because retail uses and stores types change. You don't know what they're going to be selling.
That's really why we came with this specific list. Retail is such a broad category, you could get almost anything, So.
Dog grooming is retail.
Right.
Not a good idea there.
Too much water use. Anyway.
A lot of septic use, a lot of issues about their products. Okay, so let's just see whether we even have a consensus as to 5 members.
Mr. Collins, procedurally, should we hear from the public first?
I thought you opened to the public, but
Question, not to comment.
I did, I said questions and comments.
At the same time, I apologize.
Yeah. We definitely want to hear. Madam Chairman, I'd recommend you open to the public again.
Okay. We'll open it up to comment.
Anyone online? Mute yourself, raise your hand, show us on the video.
Okay. I'll close it to the public. Tom, how do you want to go forward?
So I don't, I mean, I could try to craft a motion, but I just want to get a sense. I
Yeah,
like to call it just polling the board members without you limiting what you might add to conditions. Could the board members just run through whether they'd be prepared to perhaps approve the amendment to the use variance to remove the condition about owner occupancy and to increase the number of uses allowed besides antique stores and
or let's take one at a time. Who's in favor of the changing from owner Favor?
I'm in favor.
Yeah.
Favor.
Okay, so we've got that straight. We're gonna.
okay, so how about now, let's talk about whether you have a preference for them to come back to the board. We could have a condition that just says that you will allow, or you do grant the use variance to remove the condition about the owner occupancy and to allow additional retail uses, but with a condition that even if they meet the list, they come back to you for site plan or site plan waiver. Now that's a check and balance, it's a way to, it would be a burden, but it would give the first step of the use allowance subject to future site plan or site plan waiver, which would give you the checking of things like parking and septic. We don't even know that the septics are compliant.
Presumably the waiver could be a procedural call. Right?
No, site plan waiver would have to come to the board.
By the full board, but when you have a site plan condition on a use variance, you need 5 members to vote affirmatively yes for that type of site plan or site plan waiver.
Within that, we would cover some of the issues that Kathy was raising before, about how those might be modified, right? And right now, I think there's 2 garage doors where 2 of those parking spaces are, so I don't know if that necessarily makes those parking spaces continue to be usable or not usable, depending on what the uses are.
And I think that's why you would want to see site
Yeah.
and discuss it relative to the use.
With that.
I am too.
I'm okay. There are a lot of non-conforming issues on this property, so I think a site plan or review would be important.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so
I agree with
Well, I guess, and part of that, Tom, is that the list is specific with virtually all of those items that the
We're not
applicant.
talking about a list.
We ain't talking about
Now
a list
the
yet.
individual.
Oh, that's the next thing?
That's
yeah,
it.
well, that will be the next thing, but in my view, yes, you would have a list of both, pretty much what Mr. Kyle said, and not a such as, a list, and a list of explicitly prohibited, such as grocery stores, restaurants, convenience stores.
As far as the prohibited uses,
Limited to.
right?
So-
I'm sorry.
No objection to the prohibited uses. May I suggest, though, if there's going to be another visit to the board for purposes of site plan approval, perhaps in that situation, it wouldn't be so bad to have a such as, because then the board at that point in time, as part of the site plan review, could determine whether it's close enough to something on the list.
The board, I don't agree, I don't like that idea, but.
And I don't know if this is just semantics enough, but what I have seen in other towns' ordinance language is they give a list and it says something along the lines, or similar uses there too. Something along those lines. Now, maybe that's the same thing or not, I'm not sure. But maybe another way.
All good arguments, but I think let's focus on the list and let's constrain the list but prohibit things too. This is not an ordinance. And so it's going to be a use variance for these uses. I don't know whether the board's going to grant all these uses, but I'll try to do my best of listing them. And Paul, and even Mr. Kyle or Fred or Frank could help us, but
I'll suggest that Mr. Kyle go through the list one at a time, and I guess the board will give us at least an informal upper, yeah, something. He can cross things out that are definitely no's. And,
We'll play a little game.
Yeah, I'd like to give the applicant some comfort as to that they can tell a buyer more than, I mean, the thing that we all agree on, I think is, although it's important, is relatively not that important. I mean, I realize it's important, but I think that the reason that the applicant is here is so that Ms. Brooks can market the property without having to say, well, you have to go for a variance. It's not like a major development like Rich does, and no one wants to do a variance, let alone for relatively, I know it's not, I don't spend other people's money, relatively smaller investment. I mean, these aren't going to be big developers who come in here to do variances every day. And in order to do that, I think to accommodate, I get the sense from the board, everybody wants to accommodate, this good citizen, and I think we should find a way to provide some comfort.
that's my view. I don't think I need a list from you, Fred, right now. But let's just try to. We really can't keep doing this dialogue without reopening. So let's try to do a motion, and Janine.
You want Mr. Kyle to go through the list or
No, I got it. He can add to it once let me draft the motion, because we really have to decide, and then we can add some language in the written resolution too. That, I mean, I like to be comprehensive, and this would be a motion. So it sounds like it's a motion to approve the preliminary, I'm sorry, to approve the use variant, the amendment to the use variances previously granted for this property to the applicant to modify the prior conditions of the prior use variances to allow for removal of the restriction that the owner be the occupant, and to modify the restriction for the types of uses allowed by the use variance to include other retail uses, including saddle shops, tack shops, bookstores, shoe stores, clothing stores, tailors, upholsterers, furniture stores, stationery stores, fabric stores, professional offices, but not including any medical offices or dental offices, comma, insurance offices, studios for photographers and artists, interior design stores, travel agents, but not including any medical or dental offices, beauty salons or nail salons, and not including any restaurants, grocery stores, or convenience stores.
I would also say no food service. You don't want a coffee shop going in there. And I don't want to debate whether or not that's a restaurant.
Right, no coffee shops or food service.
And no personal fitness.
Tom, can you expand that studio to include craftsmen, like somebody who throws pots, somebody who makes cabinets, does do that kind of thing?
I guess
I think that's what the attorney here talks about, the similar uses. That's what you're
Yeah, I
saying.
don't, no, I'd rather you list, if you
Craft it in a
want,
way where we can have additional uses that fit in, then that's what we're asking.
I'd rather you didn't, because that just results in the zoning officer getting confused and authorized, whether she's authorized or not.
They have to come back here anyway.
But I'm okay, but we can also, if it's an expansion, we can have another use variance. So I don't have any problem with what you said was basket making, is that what you were saying, Rich?
Any sort of craft,
Artist
right?
space.
Artist studio.
Artisan.
Right?
Yeah, I would consider that an art studio.
Maker to a pottery guy.
Yeah, I don't think that, yeah, I think
Art-
art is very expansive, but it's also, we all know what it is. So, but this approval, this is a use variance, is subject to a condition that any use beyond antique or gift shop shall come to the land use board as a zoning board for a site plan approval, or if appropriate, a site plan waiver. And all the other standard conditions will apply to this, including Paul's and Frank's reports. Is there such a motion? And if people want to add to that, I'm open to that, but.
Tom, I just wanted to ask you, the list, what about hardware stores? You kind of skipped that.
Yeah, that one
That's
wasn't listed.
prohibited?
I think the idea was that's too much turnover.
Right, so it's not on.
It's not on the list.
It's not on the list.
Not on the list, it's not listed, it probably ought to be prohibited, so I think I better put that down. It also has, I don't know, I don't want to get into it.
Tom, I just had two questions to follow up on your suggestion with regard to the return for this site plan approval or site plan waiver. At one point you said the full board. Did you mean this full board or the full land use board? Just to be clear.
The board sitting as the Board of Adjustment, as opposed to any kind of subcommittee or the zoning officer or just Paul that was talked about. There's going to be a board review. We're going to see this person or their persons, and we're going to hear how they're going to use the two buildings and the land and work together to make it work, because that is a big issue here. That's why that issue about the two parking spaces in the garage might be important, and as could many different issues. So we're not granting a subdivision, and we do need to have a coordinated effort of the two tenants or the investor with one use and one tenant.
Come on.
Come up here, please.
I had one other business that someone had mentioned to me they were interested in, the frame shop.
That works.
Art galleries typically
If it
have
have
a
a frame
frame
in the
shop.
board definition, you can probably do that. I think you did a pretty good job outlining it, Tom, so I'd make that motion.
I'll second.
Mr. Cavallino?
Aye.
Mr. Romato? Aye. Mr. Cornelius?
Aye.
Mr. Giovanni?
Aye.
Mr. Hurst?
Aye.
Ms. Griffin? Aye. Chairman Ghetto?
Aye.
Thank you all very much.
Congratulations.
Well, yes, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Good luck.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Thank you.
I think the last thing, Madam Chair, is to schedule Peterman.
For your application. Yeah, for Peterman, okay.
When are our August meetings?
August, we have the 3rd and 10th.
Okay, well, the third, I guess.
I mean, I'll reach out to them if for some reason they don't have a professional available.
Okay.
I'm not here on the third.
So no Rich on the 3rd. Anyone else available, not available? What date?
August
3rd or August 10th, any of those days?
Do we need them both?
We don't, but I'm
We're
gonna
trying to
reach
schedule
out to
Peter.
them and hope for August 3rd, but if they say, well, our planner isn't available or our engineer, then we'll go to August 10th. But I will try tomorrow to at least let them know that we'd like to schedule them in August in particular.
Right, that's good. Okay. All right. Do you have anything else? Adjourn.
So moved. Do it.
Good night, everybody.
Third.
All right.
Good work, guys.
Yeah.
I thought that was,
That was
That was quite good on your part,
that was
everybody.
a good one.
That was
Good job.
We want to keep that building.